Everyone, welcome to the board of NHS Direct NHS Trust on the 1st of July. It is a very significant day for us. Around 300 people have left the organisation Friday, yesterday and today, and that's just a huge number. And it's a great loss to the organisation. It's another stage on our journey. Every single person who's left is important. Huge amount of work has gone in to try and make sure that as many of those people as possible have good futures to go to, which I think has been really creditable effort. Still a sad day, and in amongst those 300 people there are a couple who have had a particular significant role in the trust, one of whom is Trevor Jones. I will have the pleasure and privilege of talking more about Trevor later on today. In the formal board and on the record, I just want to say what an extraordinary contribution Trevor's made to the trust. I think, was it 2006 you joined?
2007.
2007. And you brought to the trust unique experience, expertise, and in particular judgment, which has been of enormous value to me personally and to the whole organisation. And we have to let you go gracefully, I know, because you've given such great service, but I wanted everyone to recognise, which I'm sure they do, what an enormous contribution you've made, and I will do more with that later on today.
Yeah.
So we don't have any apologies. Louisa, Donna and Tim Hayman are running late. They'll be with us shortly. I have had no declarations of interest. If anybody wants to make one now, they're very welcome to. Anyone who's watching us online is also very welcome, and if they'd like to fill in an evaluation form, that would be even more helpful. We can go straight to a couple of sets of minutes that we've got to look at. We've got minutes of the board on the 3rd of June, and we've got minutes of the 18th of June, a very short special board meeting which Trevor chaired. Can we just look first of all at the minutes of the 3rd of June meeting and take any matters of accuracy? No, I mean, one or two tiny typos I picked up, but other than that, I don't think there was anything substantive to change. No, fine. Before we go to the action log, which should pick up our maths arising, let's just have a look at the minutes of the 18th of June. Trevor, those are under your care. Is there anything you want to direct us to, or are there any issues?
I think I'd simply refer to paragraph 2.4,
yes,
where we raised the issue of concern about the head of internal audit opinion, and simply say that there is a meeting later today with the auditors to discuss that.
Thank you. Okay. Then let's go straight to the action log, which is relatively concise.
Okay. The first issue there relates to the frontline staffing requirement and numbers of actually in post, and I'm going to suggest that it's probably best to pick that up under the aegis of the business plan, but I do understand that the board actually want to see better or more granular statistical information and data on that issue, which I'll make sure we supply you with. But can I suggest that we pick that up in the context of the revised business plan? The second issue, this was added between Jackie and Chris in terms of the correlation or otherwise between what's reported financially and the situation on the ground. Can you cast light on that?
I think one of the things that we have now done as part of the budget reset is developed a sensitivity analysis so that we will be better able to look at the scorecard and the financial report and be able to match the two.
Good. What?
Okay. Third issue is Tricia.
Yeah, and there is an update there, Nick, which says that we will bring a review of our report to our response to the Francis report to the Clinical Governance Committee in September, and then on to the board.
Okay. Next item is closed, and then the final one was in relation to the discussion about the call review. I'm not sure that the board actually did ask that we develop a bespoke tool.
No.
I think it
I
questioned.
think we looked at it.
Yeah.
I think we'd like to look at it again, probably, when we talk about the calls that we've just listened to. Tricia, is there anything you'd like to say now, or is that a discussion
No,
best
I'll
left
leave
to...
it to the discussion.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Well, we can then, in a moment, move into the performance section of the agenda today. I mean, the big ticket item for today is the business plan and budget.
Mhm.
I'm not sure that we will be having an enormously detailed debate on that, given that it is really about the setting of a baseline, and further refinements will be made as discussions continue with our commissioners. So just to let you know that it is the headline item, but it may not be an item that we spend a huge amount of time on this time around. Let's then go into performance, starting with Nick, your Chief Executive's report.
So the first item, the board asked for data on the use of the 0845 contingency area by area, and I've provided that for you. We've taken the week beginning the 10th of June without a bank holiday. As you can see, there are the biggest user is the West Midlands, followed by South East Coast in volume terms, and roughly evenly split, a third, between the areas where NHS Direct is the 111 provider, where another 111 provider is providing the service and 0845 is backing it up, and where there is no 111 service operating at all.
Nick, I think it would be very interesting, not necessarily need to be reported in a formal board meeting, to look at that data with the denominator being the population. And so what we would see is that where there's no 111 service,
Yeah.
it would be 100% of demand in that area.
There's a number of so I have done some comparisons.
Nuances.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the first nuance is clearly some areas are bigger than others, which is what you're pointing out. Absolutely. Secondly, though, the proportion of the population who are phoning 0845 rather, varies area to area. So you've seen some areas where the 111 service volumes are picking up. 0845 has kind of naturally declined as a choice that patients are making. So
I think I'd like to ask you, maybe not in a formal board, but to have a look
Sure.
at what that tells us about an understanding of the population that we're serving. So,
I agree with that, thank you. And Nick, just it's a bit pedantic, I know, but where you've got in your report areas served by another 111 provider, I think we all know you mean other 111 providers, plural. So there's a sort of implicit singular there. So can we be clear and just get the wording right?
They're not all the same.
There's several of them, and we know that, but for
Okay.
others who are reading this.
Fine. Yep. Okay.
moving on.
So, secondly, just to update the board on 111, we continue to provide extremely good levels of access, handling between 30 and 40% of the contracted levels. But for those calls that are directed towards NHS Direct, we are serving them well. We continue to be in close dialogue with commissioners and NHS England about the future of our other 111 contracts, but we have reached agreement, and this is reflected in the letters. Apologies, the first dispatch only included the letter to Cornwall, but there is an exactly exactly similar letter that I wrote to North Essex, which are in the public domain, basically indicating that we are not in a position to mobilise those services as the contract terms are financially unsustainable. And I've proffered an apology on behalf of the board, because clearly that the situation that we are not in a position to fulfil the contract that the organisation signed up for is a matter for some regret. But it is what it is, and we need to enable those commissioners to move on and appoint other providers to mobilise their 111 service, which is what I believe they intend to do. So beyond that, there's nothing more that I can say in terms of the discussion with other commissioners, but I'm hoping that agreement will be reached before too much longer.
Steve?
Yeah, the 30 to 40% of the contracted levels being met, how close is that to what we're forecasting for the recovery plan?
So our, not quite sure how to answer the question. So our budget is based upon a continuation of the existing proportion of calls that we're currently taking. So it's what we expect in terms of the forecast numbers is we're expecting to continue to meet that level of calls. Is that what you were asking?
Well, yeah, it just, the 40% sounded better than the figure that was quoted to me earlier.
It varies day by day, and part of that is whether the commissioner forecast is appropriately profiled across the days of the week and the year and the month and the weeks. But essentially, the numbers of calls that we're getting is what we're expecting, and that hasn't altered very much. It is an interesting footnote, though, that the volume of calls that we get is not determined by telephony infrastructure pointing calls in one direction or another. It's determined by, first and foremost, what patients are choosing to ring, whether they're choosing to ring their old out of hours number or their GP surgery or 111. It's also determined by what's on the answer machines of their GP surgeries. And instead of saying phone 111, it's saying phone this number, which is the old out of hours number. But if the public view of 111 were to change, these call volumes could change quite significantly and very quickly. Because if you phone 111, you get through to us.
Okay. Thank you. That was an interesting insight. New one. Okay, I'd just like to say something on behalf of the board to the commissioners and the populations in areas where we're not mobilising. So I think just want to make very clear that the board expressed its deep regret that we're not able to meet those contracts that we were awarded and to mobilise the service, and that's we understand that must be frustrating for the people who chose us to deliver the service, and it's very disappointing that we're not able to do it. However, the worst thing we can do is mobilise a service that we're not able to deliver effectively and safely. And so I'm sure it's the right decision, Nick, and I know you've been talking to the commissioners about it, but it's not a decision that we took lightly, and it's not one that we're happy with. It's the right thing to do in the circumstances. Okay, shall we move on into the performance package? Jackie, would you like to navigate us through this?
Okay, so I'll largely just be focusing on the corporate scorecard and then touching on the finance report. This is the corporate scorecard for May, so some of the numbers may be slightly different to the numbers that Nick has just been quoting because he's been quoting numbers for June. But you know, I think the salient points are that we answered about 31% of contracted 111 calls during May, and an average 38% of historic volumes for our 845 contingency service, and there are similar volumes, percentage volumes seen for all other services as well. Generally, largely because the volumes are low, performance is good, in particular for the non-clinical access to services. I am, however, concerned that when you look at the finance report, we continue to have overspends on 111 call handling budgets in particular, and we've got very high performance, 99% access and 60 and 0% abandonment. That would suggest to me that we do need to have an urgent review of the number of call handlers, as we clearly have just got too many for our current need. The next point I'd just like to make is on the complaints per 10,000 calls. I noticed that we do have an amber against the 0845 contingency. I'd just like to say that this is actually an error in the data. There were in fact only 11 complaints across all services, not against each service. So overall it equates for all services to about 0.4% per 10,000 calls, which is more in line with what we would expect. You will notice that we are behind target for complaints actioned within deadlines. Again, I can confirm that it's an administrative backlog and does not mean that key actions have not been addressed. And we would hope that this metric should improve significantly next month. It is largely administrative, but Trish may be able to say a bit more about that one. Yeah. Warm transfers to a clinician and callbacks within 10 minutes do remain a problem for us, and so those areas are still red. And again, Chris may be able to comment on the performance of those. Average handling time is red against the targets that we've set ourselves by the end of June, but we are making good progress, in particularly on the call handler target. As part of the budget reset proposal, I think I indicated earlier, we've now, following Finance Committee on Tuesday, developed a sensitivity analysis for the capacity plan. This is indicating really that the key assumptions in the capacity plan are largely directly direct correlation with the financial plan as well. So we will be noting, particularly in the variances in the finance report in future, the impact of changes to the assumptions against plan. From a financial perspective, we have a year-to-date deficit of £2.8 million, and the revised budget that we'll be discussing later on in the meeting would suggest that we'll be heading for a deficit of £26 million if we continue to provide 111 services in the current proportion of volumes. So they were the key points I wanted to raise, unless anyone has any questions.
Tricia.
Just for a point of clarity, Chair, the complaints actioned within deadline, the number of complaints are meeting the target, which is 20 days of completion to address complaints. This is actions where learning has arisen out of a complaint that needs to be completed, and so the scoring is correct. There is a action plan that has been developed between David Ford, our Associate Director of Clinical Governance, and the two clinical leads, Leslie Self and Stuart Tolson, to do a whole system review of those actions and close the ones which are completed where the actual finalisation of the completion documentation hasn't been entered into date. So there is a whole system review to bring that target up to date.
Okay.
So we're answering our complaints in good time. It's the follow-up action.
Correct. So it's the actions arising out of those complaints, and I also need to add any urgent or immediate action is taken. These are often where giving feedback to individuals, and then the demonstration that the individual has undertaken a learning programme, completed that learning programme, and then have that signed off within the dated programme. And as Jackie alluded to, the issue behind this is the administrative function and the time it takes to actually close these down, as well as issues with staff having left the organisation before signing off some of these issues. So the work's been done, but the member of staff has left the organisation before they've gone back into the system and closed these issues down.
Okay, thanks, Tricia. I think we get the point about that. People who've complained are getting a response.
Correct.
There's a whole lot of follow-up stuff, some of which has been difficult to tie down, but it's being looked at. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else on performance or one? I mean, I'd like to say, Jackie, that I think the corporate scorecard's very helpful. I think there are two related issues. One is that the summary, it's not easy to tell where you're talking about 111 and where you're talking about 0845. You can do it by looking at the numbers and then looking at the scorecard, but that's got to be clearer. I think there's another question which is about what level of detail we want behind the overview scorecard, because this is very high level now.
So
in the super level summary.
Yeah, in the private part of the board today we've got some detail behind this.
So I think there's a question about
and the business
public and private, which we don't necessarily, we may decide that actually that's fine for the moment. but I think it's helpful to make it clear that this overview picture is supplemented by a whole lot of detail, a lot of which is in the private agenda.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anything else on... Nick, do you want to add anything to...
No, I was just going to, just in terms of the point you just made about public-private, I mean, all of the information that the board looks at on performance should be in the public part of the agenda. Quite clear about that. I think what we're trying to do is to ask the board which pieces of information does it want to have on its radar, and that's why we're having the discussion in the private part of the meeting, simply to go through and say, actually, we want this level of detail, not this level of detail. So all of our performance information will be and needs to be in the public domain.
Okay, very good. Then I think we're on to the business plan and budget. Okay, so my understanding is, Nick, you're going to do an overview introduction to the business plan, and then Jackie and Chris are going to talk about the financial and operational aspects of the plan.
So there are three elements to this. The first is the new revised business plan for 13-14. The second is actually in response to Trevor Jones' reminder that we needed to have a bit more detail for the board on the delivery of 0845. So an 0845 delivery plan, which is a kind of subset to the business plan. And then Jackie's paper on the revised financial baseline. So those are the three elements that we're going to look at. The context for this is that I had hoped that by the time we met today, we would have reached agreement with commissioners about the future of our 111 services in particular. That would have enabled us to have completed a revised business plan for the remainder of the year that set out in both summary level and with some granularity the plans that we have for the remainder of this year. Unfortunately, that's not been possible, and what you have in front of you is a new baseline, which I'm confident as a baseline represents what will happen if the trust continues to operate as it operates today, and what sensible measures we can put in place to contain our costs, to deliver our services well, to assure quality, and all of the rest of it. However, what I'm not able to do is to determine, because we don't know the future of our 111 services, and that's still under discussion, what the follow-on action will be once agreement has been reached. And therefore, I anticipate within a matter of weeks, we will come back to the board with a revision to this business plan once we've reached agreement with commissioners about the future of our 111 services. So this is a new baseline. It is accurate in that sense, but I anticipate that there will be changes that we need to come back to the board and get agreed. I hope that makes some kind of sense.
Does anybody want to ask any questions or make any comments about that overview before we go on and look at some of the detail? Okay, let's go.
So do you have a time plan for when we're trying to get it?
As soon as possible.
Okay.
So I will update the board later on in the agenda with the latest information that I have from our meeting on Friday.
Thank you.
So those were my opening remarks. Just to
ringmaster the...
Okay. So in terms of the overall corporate objectives, we've set those as to continue to deliver all of our services well, and there are different elements to that: the 111 delivery plan, 0845, the digital and other services, which the board may want to go into a bit more detail about, to ask operationally how we're going to do that. Assuring the quality and safety for patients, and ensuring that the way that we operate our services meets safety and quality criteria. continuing to provide the necessary support and infrastructure for those operational services, and managing our finances for the remainder of the year. And then finally, implementing plans for the future of the services when we've reached agreement with commissioners, and that's the element that we're really not able at the moment to spell out. We've again, the board asks that we set out the principles that will underpin the delivery of our services for the remainder of the year, and we've continued with the same principles that governed our 0845-111 transition in terms of the high-level principles: protecting patients, the public purse, ensuring that our staff have continuity of service, and that we continue to provide services, and that we maintain high standards of governance and accountability. And those are the things that will drive the executive team for this business plan period. So I don't know whether the board would like to hear more about the practical considerations that have gone into the revised capacity plan and determining frontline performance. Chris is in a position to talk about that, both for 111 and 0845.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please. Okay.
So,
Chris,
where would you like me to start?
why don't you start with the underpinning assumptions that you've deployed in order to create the plan, and then we can understand what the logical rationale is, and we can ask you any detail that we want to know.
Yep. So, with respect to 111, the specific assumptions I think that are worth noting are when we did the recovery plans, we were working to a targeted reduction in the average handle time for nurses to come down to 690 seconds by the end of June and 550 seconds for health advisors by the end of June. Within the business plan, the budget associated with it, we've now put in a figure of 730 seconds for nurse advisors, which reflects current performance. It's much improved from the start point in April, but it's not quite got down to where we wanted it to. And the discussions that Jackie and Nick and I have had are about reflecting the reality of the situation. We'll still try to get down to the 690, and the operation is still targeted to achieve that, but in terms of the budget, it's put in at 730. The health advisors have remained at 550. They've shown a steady incremental decrease over time and are currently at around 560 for the last week, and we expect them to come down to 550 within the first couple of weeks of July. The other important change within the budget for 111 was with respect to handoff. The board may remember in April we baselined the handoff to nurse advisor at 26%, and at the time that was felt to be reflective of performance. We're currently averaging at around 30%, which has a significant impact on the budget required. And again, we've reflected the 30% in the budget plan going forward, but the operation are working with the likes of Stuart Toulson and so on to effect a reduction in the handoff. One thing to note, particularly with respect to the handoff, is it doesn't necessarily indicate behavioural failings, for want of a better expression. It could be driven by pathways and a number of other constraints within the process and the system, and that's one of the reasons why we're working closely with Stuart around the feedback for the individual agent, but also looking at the processes. Those are the two key elements that then drive into the capacity plan. The other element is obviously the forecast volume that we touched on earlier on. That's based on current run rates. Nick has already outlined the risk in terms of those run rates, which is they might change, and we have little control over how they change if patients choose to ring something different. However, based on the run rates, the operational forecast is within 100 to 150 calls of what we actually get each day at the moment, so it's accurate.
Localisation is the other thing.
In terms of localisation, we're delivering warm transfer calls to nurses to the next available nurse, so they're not locally driven. What we've seen is an increase in performance based on what we've looked at there, which is May's scorecard of the warm transfers going up to about 80%. As opposed to the 74 that we saw in May. However, for health advisors, the call delivery remains locally prioritised with an overflow out predominantly into Milton Keynes at peak points. One of the pieces of work that the contact centre planning function are doing for me that I'm expecting tomorrow is the phased reduction in the call-off to conduit, reflecting the financial concerns that Jackie talked about earlier on today. One of the reasons we need to do that in a phased way is we need to avoid unintended consequence, and we need to be quite careful about how we direct the reduction in the call-off, because we don't want a blanket reduction at all sites, because that might have unintended consequence in terms of the performance at an individual contract level. Once we've got those phasings, I'll need to work with Jackie and her team to determine if that gets us where we need to be in terms of finance quick enough. And depending on the answer and the analysis that we do there, we'll then have to revisit the phasing as appropriate.
Thank you, Chris. Lots of questions. Trevor Jones, then Steve.
That was very helpful. I'd like a couple of assurances, I think. When we conducted the Go Live review, we heard that there was a view around some operational managers and some of the capacity planning staff that the targets that were set were too optimistic and were imposed top down and didn't have the hearts and minds of the people who had to deliver them. So can you assure us that that isn't the case with the figures you're using now?
Yes, I can do so more fully now than I could in April, I think. In April, when the position we were in, we had 2 weeks worth of data. We did a lot of engagement activity with various parts of the organisation and people involved in mobilisation and in current delivery and so on, to gauge what we thought were realistically achievable. I think the performance has borne out that perhaps we were too optimistic in terms of what we can achieve in the time frame with nurses, but we were there pretty much with health advisors, and the changes that we put into the budget plan are based on the look back over the enriched data. So we've got 2.5 months worth of stable data now. So they're based on actual performance.
Thank you, Chris. Steve?
It was about certainty of data and it's just been answered.
Peter?
My question is just about the this phasing issue. I see that as quite complex, actually, and could easily cause difficulty, shall we say. I hear that our performance is doing well because we're achieving the 100% and things that we should, and therefore we're pulling back a bit.
Yeah.
How are you underpinning to make sure that we don't pull back too much?
So
too quickly, too much, too quickly.
What we've got to do is look at the step levels of reduction and the sort of time frame within we can do it. Now, we always need to be aware of the financial envelope, but the first, if you like, start point for doing this work is whether we can ensure the service levels are achieved, and that's going to be the main driver up until the point where we provide Jackie's team with something to review in terms of finance. It is quite a complex picture, and it's made complex by the way in which we are currently delivering calls. So we've got conduit resource at Middlebrook, Milton Keynes, Dudley and Beckenham. The temptation is to reduce the amount of hours we call off from conduit entirely at Milton Keynes, but it may have an unintended consequence where we denude the overflow and therefore our performance at peak of the right staff and the right skill set. So I think, Peter, that it's difficult to answer in a succinct way, but when we work through the phasing, what we'll do is make sure that we've got a high-level summary that we can share, obviously, with the board and others to illustrate how we're going to maintain service levels and achieve the financial.
Can I give a very practical way in which we can do this without? So we are not going to take risks with service levels for patients. So the way to move forward is to have staff rostered on duty, but not connected to the telephone. In other words, we'll make the reductions by restricting the number of people who are actually to the new plan, but actually still have people sitting there on shift, waiting to be switched back in should our service levels drop, so that we can experiment, but without having to take risks. So we can reduce the number of staff to the new levels that we think are the right levels, but by having other staff waiting there in a contingency mode in the event that we need to switch them back in. And that can be done within a very short space of time.
What's the margin you're working with?
Well, the margin is set by the service levels in the contracts.
The extra capacity that you would have on
Doesn't mean
standby.
financial margin.
Yes, I am talking about that. Yes.
Well, we'll start with the levels that we've currently got called off, and we'll start reducing the staffing to the new capacity level plan, but we won't actually have reduced our staffing overall. So I would imagine we'll have 10 or 15% extra within the current staffing arrangement.
Sorry, Peter, a bit of context that may help here is that Conduit have their health advisor on contracts of between 17 and 40 hours. What that means is they're not fixed at 17 or fixed at 40, their contracts allow variation.
Yeah.
The ideal way to achieve the reduction is for them to reduce the staff down to 17 hours,
Yes.
and therefore we retain the staff and the skill set with the flexibility to lift it back up again
Yeah.
should we need to.
It does sound, to be honest, slightly odd. And what sounds odd is we've been looking for a couple of months now at access performance, which is more or less perfect, more or less 100% access and answer within 60. And so we've known that, and this board has observed on a couple of occasions, that there must be excess capacity in the system in order to be able to deliver that around call handlers. And it almost sounds as though, until Jackie noticed we were overspending, that sort of that's been the trigger for thinking, oh my goodness, how do we take money out of the system? And then to hear beyond that actually what we need to do is to have people sitting around doing nothing until we're really sure that we can let them go, sounds like our operational levers, our operational, our management information and our operational levers aren't really as effective and fine-tuned as we would hope that they would be.
I put it a different way. I think what you're observing is extreme reluctance, and very much we're being risk averse in having service levels that drop in an unplanned or unrealistic, unanticipated way, and that we simply want to make sure that in reducing down from the levels of staffing that we've currently got to the new level that's enshrined within the budget, that we don't take any risks with any unplanned consequences in the way that we do that. And I think that's perfectly sensible to do it that way, because clearly there is a huge spotlight on the continued delivery of good service levels, and the system is simply is very risk averse. So we're reflecting that in the way that we've managed this change downwards.
I think my query is not about whether we should be conservative, which I'm sure we should. It's the fact that in order to be conservative, our instruments are so blunt. So this seems to, that seems a bit disappointing. I think the stance is right. I think that the practical actions that we're having to take to do it speak of a disappointing ability to flex resource, manage, know what's going to happen, plan and manage.
Warm transfer. You've got agreement with the commissioners that can be done on a wider network.
We've informed commissioners that that's what we've done.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I was just okay. It makes sense. It makes absolute sense, and I think
we've informed commissioners that that's what we have done.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Sue, then Tim.
We talked about excess capacity and call handlers, but what about nurses? What are the challenges on nurse recruitment? And do we have enough? I'm just conscious that the handoff rate's going up. The warm transfer rate is still 75%. What are the pressures on nurse fulfilment, particularly in the evenings and weekends, I guess?
So in terms of the pressures on nurse fulfilment, we typically have a shortfall on a Saturday evening in particular. We've also noticed shortfalls on a Sunday evening within set intervals, so there's shortfalls within an hour, possibly two, and it reflects what I've spoken about before, which is the change in the weekend profile. When we were building the capacity plan and submitting it into Jackie, what we've worked out is that shortfall of the requirement, although it's double figures of nurses, it's about 10, can be as high as 18 at its worst. It represents about 30% of the capacity required within that interval. So we've worked an uplift into the budget because that shortfall is the sum of a number of different factors, some of which are modelled within the capacity plan and some of which aren't.
Sorry, could you speak up, Chris?
Sorry, yes. So the best way of illustrating this is perhaps to say that for May, when you look at the capacity required over a month, we were 11 nurses over, which is probably too close to comfort, but that was still delivering us in May shortfalls on a Saturday evening. Therefore, that indicates that we don't have enough nurses when you take into account the variations in fulfilment and scheduling and a number of other things. So we've factored that into the budget and lifted it slightly to account for that shortfall. We've got recruitment underway at the moment, so we've got 8 at Dudley and 2 at Middlebrook heads of nurses in training at the moment. They're expected to come out, and there's potentially a further 6 to 8.
Agency nurses.
Agency nurses, yes, sorry, they're not substantive. So we are starting to supplement that nurse capacity, and it's coming through. We've also finished the work we need to do to begin the call-off through Hayes for the winter ramp-up, which we need to start now rather than in September in order to get us the gain that we need with sufficient leg time to give us a real prospect of getting the number we require. We're having to do that irrespective of the conversations that Nick is conducting with the ambulance trusts, because there's no agreement as yet.
Tim?
Yeah, you just mentioned winter, which we had a good look at this in the Finance Committee last week, but we didn't ask about winter. We've never run 111 across winter except in a pilot. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you fed that into the budget?
So for winter, as for a number of other areas like the August bank holiday, we're not using the 0845 profile because we've got a different profile for 111 calls, but we are using the insight that's derived from 0845 because we have no other insight. And as you say, no one's ever run 111 at winter.
In terms of the step up in the volume of calls that we expect.
Yes, yes. So no one's ever run 111 at winter, so there is an element of unknown to it. But we've essentially used what Nick just described as the elements of uplift within the 111 profile to create what we think is an accurate picture of what may happen. But we've got to acknowledge that there are risks to it because it's a service that's 3 months old.
Sure.
That then is obviously built into the capacity plan and run through.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else just in terms of drilling down into what's underlying the numbers in the business plan and the budget that everybody wants to do now? No? Should we talk, Jackie, you've explained to us, Nick, between you, that the overall shape and the finances and the assumptions that are driving those. I'm not sure if there's anything much, Jackie, you want to add to that.
I think the only other area of risk other than the capacity plan is on the income levels for 111 services. So the assumption that we've got in our plan is that commissioners will pay us for the work that we do at the current proportions, assuming we carry on until the end of March.
Very easy.
But it's fair to say that nobody, apart from a very small amount of cash from North West Commissioner, none of the other commissioners have given us any payment at all for 111 services yet this financial year. And so there is a risk that we won't achieve those levels of income. And they've partly not given us anything because they want to make sure that they have enough money left over to do whatever it's going to cost them to provide the calls that we're not taking.
But we're up to date on our invoicing.
We've invoiced, yes, so we have invoiced and we've found out who the contacts are, but nobody's paying at the moment.
Can I check what agreement you have with NHS England and the Trust Development Authority on this issue?
So I've escalated the lack of agreement on 111 income to the NHS TDA because the way in which our discussions have proceeded with NHS England is that essentially the income that NHS Direct will receive for its 111 service is the balancing item, and they're working their way through what all the other costs are before they come to reaching agreement with us. And what that means is that we have no agreement in place with NHS England or local commissioners about what income we'll receive. We've made reasonable assumptions, and we've provided them with written proposals, but that agreement has not yet been reached. And I've escalated my concern to the TDA that that agreement isn't in place, and we're now in July. And having had 1 quarter's worth of delivering services with a top level value of £45 million, that's really quite a major concern. Clearly it gives rise to the need for cash to be provided to us, otherwise we can't pay our bills. And Jackie has the arrangements of that and the assurances both from the TDA and Department of Health that that cash will be forthcoming. But it simply means that in terms of predicting the financial position for the remainder of the year, whilst we can manage our costs, we were talking about some of the issues in managing our costs, we have no means at the moment of predicting our income sufficiently, and that is a major concern.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I presume the TDA has a meeting in July, but they won't have one in August, so we could end up at the end of Q2 with no decision for them.
I don't think it's dependent upon board cycles of the TDA.
Okay.
So I don't think that's a concern. I do have a concern if it carries on that we don't get agreement with commissioners about the amount of income that we can reasonably expect.
I think what's important is at this stage in the public domain we log the fact that those agreements haven't yet been reached, and we might want to talk about them more. For me, I think that certainly puts great stress on the need for a phased cash flow, because being able to pay our bills is it's absolutely not negotiable. We've got to be able to pay.
And there's I have to say there is no doubt about that. Both the Department of Health and the TDA are being absolutely clear about that, and that's very important from our suppliers and our staff's point of view. That there is no question here of us not being able to meet our commitments. That's common ground. What we're talking about is the income and expenditure as opposed to cash numbers. Proving extremely elusive in terms of reaching agreement.
I'm reassured if we've got that clear agreement with NHS England and the TDA. Squabbles within the family with individual commissioners don't worry me. If the ultimate funder of the NHS is in agreement with us.
Louisa.
It's just what you said, it sounded like commissioners were saying, well, we don't want to give you the money because we think that it might cost us a lot to sort of, to provide the service that you're not. So presumably they are sort of spending that money and handing that money over because those providers are then presumably there is a sort of logistical problem in actually where we get the money from if they go, oops, sorry, we haven't got enough.
Yeah, although we do have this national group which is chaired by NHS England, and we think that is the best arrangement to have, so that we have an agreement nationally about how, what we're going to do rather than us trying to negotiate on an individual basis. But so far we've yet to reach the final agreement.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. Any other questions or comments?
There's just one from me, Chair, which is to acknowledge the fact that in the last 3 months we've put a new management team in place, and the staff themselves have had to cope with changing circumstances, new managers, new systems, and they've done a really good job in delivering the improvements that you're seeing in some of the performance. There's still work to do, obviously, but I think it's worth acknowledging the fact that they have delivered improvements in a very trying time.
That's great. Thank you for highlighting that, Chris. We've seen some of those numbers, but it's good to have that acknowledged and that on the table. I think we're then in a position where we can approve this budget on the understanding that it's a baseline, and further discussions with our commissioners and the TDA are almost only going to mean some changes. But this is the
budget
do nothing
and the business plan.
So this is the do nothing option, if you like, but things are going to happen.
It's the carry on and stay calm option.
It's the steady as she goes option. Okay, that's fine. We're then able to move on to the governance and compliance section of the agenda. Alan, you're going to introduce for us the corporate risk register.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, that's item 8 on the agenda. The individual items that are shown on the register, the board, I think, will be reassured to know are all derived from the content of the now approved revised business plan for the year, and this was reviewed in some detail both at the Audit Committee and at the Finance Committee last week, and one very cogent observation that was made was, why are we, for some risks, showing the same residual risk rating as inherited risk when there are a number of control measures listed as being planned? And I think that's the issue, is that at this stage in the year it's too soon for some of the actions to have actually shown through to the level that we're then targeting in terms of risk reduction. That is apparent from the scores. As far as the content is concerned, sitting behind the business plan objectives is a separate programme of work that will be measuring each month and more regularly in some of the key objectives the delivery of the components of each of the 5 major corporate objectives that Nick mentioned in his presentation of the business plan, and from that a new risk register is being prepared, which will be brought together for the next board meeting and updated with the version you have here. But for the time being, I'm content that the risks that are shown in this version of the corporate risk register do represent the major areas that we need to be focusing on this time. I didn't really want to add much more than that to the detail.
Has anybody got any questions on that? So of course we also have we continue to have a private risk register, which we'll be looking at later, as we may have some further conversation around that, I suspect. Okay, thank you then. Let's look at our various feedback and minutes from committees that have been meeting since the board last met. So we've got minutes from the Clinical Governance Committee on the 10th of May. We've had some verbal feedback on that one, Sue, already, haven't we? So does anybody have any questions or issues about that set of minutes? Audit Committee on the 17th of June. Feedback, because we haven't got any minutes yet. Is that right?
I think the main focus was on the annual report and accounts, which
Yes,
of course came to the 18th of June meeting. Trevor very kindly chaired that, and Sue made the views of the audit committee clear. I suppose the only thing to say, Trevor alluded to it earlier, that coming out of the internal audit discussions, we are going to have a further meeting with the internal auditors this afternoon. And should there be anything emerging from that, we'll report back to the board subsequently. Otherwise, it was a meeting of annual reports, basically, which we dealt with in quite a great deal of detail and numbers.
Okay, so we've got also on the agenda the Audit Committee annual report, annual plan in terms of reference. Do you want to do that now, and then we'll go back to the Finance Committee? That makes sense? Leave the floor with you. So we have a substantial package.
So the annual report.
Yep.
First one, 10.1. Again, what I would say about the annual report, it describes the work we've done and our review of our activities, and you'll see there's a checklist that's been produced. There may or may not be some comments that might come forward later as a result of our discussion with the internal auditors. As a result of that, I might say something about this report subsequently under the internal audit section.
Yep.
But as it stands at the moment, I'll leave it as it is, but we'll come back if there is anything. That's the only thing I wanted to say about it.
Do you want to say anything about the plan or terms of reference? Then we can just no.
They're very routine, straightforward.
Does anybody have any questions for Peter about that audit committee package, the report, the plan, and the terms of reference? No? Okay, thank you very much, Peter. And we're very aware of the heavy workload that your committee always takes, and we are very appreciative of the work that it does on our behalf.
Losing one of the heavyweight members who you mentioned earlier, Trevor.
You are.
Swim and athletic, I prefer.
Sorry, Trevor. Intellectually.
So Tim, can we come back to you? You've had very recently you've had a finance committee meeting. You've already mentioned it, and in fact, the work that was done in that meeting has been mentioned to me separately by Nick and Jackie. So
yes, very quickly, thank you, Joanne. We've already talked about the revised plan. We spent a lot of time on the revised business plan and requested the sensitivity analysis that you've already heard about this morning, and that was the major bit of the meeting. But two other things to mention. We also looked at capital for the year. It'd be very easy to reduce capital to zero, and the committee's view was that there may be some items of capital that we need to spend money on this year, and we referred to the decision that we sponsored a couple of years ago, if you recall, about the telephony system, where the telephony system was going full speed ahead. Then we knew about the 111 programme and we cut it back, and we made some sensible decisions about capital investment in telephony, which have proven to be right, actually. So that was good. So we've asked the executive to look again at capital to make sure that there may well be some items of spend that we ought to have in the budget this year. I've not heard back from that. We brought forward, we have a programme for the year now, which I guess you'll see that next year. At the next meeting, in the next set of minutes. We have a programme for the year, but we brought forward the October meeting into September so that we could have a good look at financial performance before the end of Q2. So we're going to have a meeting in September rather than October now, because we've heard this morning, looking at performance and the assumptions underneath that, we need to keep a pretty close eye on what's actually happening out in the business, so we thought September was the best time to do that. Otherwise, Jackie, is there anything I've left out?
No.
Do you want to mention Milton Keynes? And the
doesn't look like it.
Okay, good.
No, we just had a further discussion about the ground floor lease.
Yes,
Yeah.
which we've resolved, and
you have.
Moving forward in terms of the maintaining flexibility, but also maintaining our options.
Good, thank you. That's all, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Any questions to Tim about the Finance Committee meeting? No? Okay, so the last item in our governance section of our agenda today is the placing in the public domain of the Go Live Review report, which was commissioned by the board in conjunction with NHS England and the NHS TDA. So I think everybody around this table has a very vivid recollection that as soon as it was clear late in March that there were significant problems in the mobilisation of our main large-scale 111 contracts, we agreed a set of three things that were essential to do. Number one, overriding importance, was to get the performance stabilised and safe for patients, which was the first thing that we did, and that we completed that quite successfully with a great deal of support from our commissioners and from other parts of the NHS. The second thing we wanted to do was to understand why things had gone wrong and why we went live without the full capacity that we needed. This report sits under that item in the three-point plan, and the third point was to determine the ongoing viability of the 111 contracts and the organisation, and that is, as we've already discussed today, is ongoing. So coming back to what we did to understand the causes of our service failures, we got together with NHS England and the TDA, and we wanted to have a rigorous external objective review undertaken by people who were well qualified to do it, to help us understand what went wrong. And the report which you see today is the result of that exercise. There was a follow-on process which was run by the non-executive directors, whereby they considered the conclusions and the recommendations of the report. They listened to the perspectives of the executive directors most closely involved, and they formed their own conclusions as to the issues and drivers and what needed to be done over and above what was already in hand. That process is close to completion now. So, and this is a very significant report for the organisation. We have agreed as a non-executive group that we confirm and support, broadly speaking, the conclusions in the report. We have, as you would expect, still some issues of detail, but we don't feel it's particularly useful to open those up. The point is that the overarching conclusions are directionally correct, enough for us to reach an informed view about what needed to be done, and those things have been put in place. I'm happy to take questions. Certainly the case that the non-executives have spent a great deal of time looking at this report and discussing it, so I'm not altogether surprised that it hasn't, that there isn't more conversation today. It certainly doesn't reflect a lack of interest and detailed examination of everything that's in this report. So thank you. This is really an opportunity to put it in the public domain and to move on. I suggest we take a break now for 5 minutes and then come back to discuss patient experience. Thanks a lot. I consider it an advantage to be able to cut through the discussion, so thank you for chatting so that I can...
Yeah, our listeners on the web will be interested to know what feedback they've got given the proximity of the...
We did it. We were doing it deliberately so you could do it to us.
And now what I've done is... oh good, got a spare pen. That's fine. Thank you. We resume the public board meeting with the third main section of our agenda, which is about the interaction with stakeholders. We don't have any, I haven't had reported to me any specific engagement visits with staff around the system. Sue, would you like to?
Yes, I did actually. Sorry, and I forgot to mention to you.
Nice surprise here as well.
Last Monday I was up at Milton Keynes, where primarily, or initially to sit down with David Ford, the Associate Clinical Governance to go through DATIX and the serious incident reviews, and just to walk through a number of complaints from the point of inception through to the very end, and just walk through to see how the process worked, to ensure that it was responsive, it was transparent, and I guess resilient, that we actually closed out the complaints appropriately. I then went into the call centre and sat and listened to a number of calls, and the thing that really struck me was just the sheer commitment and motivation in very difficult circumstances that the staff that I met showed. You know, they were clearly aware of what was happening in the press, and that was affecting
morale, etc. But actually they just wanted to keep going, providing the best service, and I thought that was admirable, really. And then I listened to some of the calls, and the thing that struck me most clearly was just how, I think we've talked about it before, just how clunky everything is, how questions after questions after questions on the pathway, that it's actually very difficult to navigate through, and I think it highlighted for me how reducing the call length is not an easy thing to do, and is going to require some very close attention, and I know Chris and Trish are doing that, but looking at numbers, thinking 768 for a clinician call, to get down to 730 doesn't sound that great a leap, but actually practice watching it, it's not going to be easy. So I just want to say thank you to the staff I met at Milton Keynes for being so welcoming.
Can I just ask a supplementary? Thank you, Joanne. Somewhere in the papers, the next release of Pathways is mentioned. When we last spoke about this, there was no date for the next release. Do we know when that next release is yet, or is it still?
I don't know, but Chris or
November is the next full release of Pathways. There was a small update in June, but the next full release will be early November.
And are we reporting these clunkiness issues?
Yes, we have a whole governance process around our requests for change, which are both system and clinical content requests that we submit.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's not till November.
Sue, how busy was the contact centre when you were there? What sort of time of day were you there?
It was about 10 o'clock.
On a weekday?
On a weekday. And the calls were coming through very quickly, so I must have sat there for well over an hour and a half, and there were only 3 calls that came through. I was listening with a nurse. It reminded me again that I need to go in the evening or at night, just to see how different it feels.
Thank you. All right. Thanks a lot for reporting back. It's very good to hear how well our staff are coping in these difficult circumstances and how they're continuing to demonstrate their commitment to patients. Shall we then move on to the call recordings, which we asked for? Given the significance of the North West and the West Midlands 111 contract, we asked to listen to some calls from those services, and we had a couple here. I just want to ask these questions. Anybody not managed to listen to them?
I couldn't make password work.
Couldn't make
No.
Okay, so there were some password problems. That's a shame. I would recommend that you get some help and listen to them. I think it sounds like enough people have heard the calls to make it a useful conversation. And just to remind us what we do this because it's imperative that we continue to stay close to the service that our patients actually receive, and that although this isn't a scientifically determined sample, we have found that these listening to these calls does raise systematic issues that are definitely worth exploring. Would anyone, Tricia, would you like to just introduce them and then briefly, we'll read the papers.
Thank you, Chair. These calls were originally requested for our previous board meeting, but due to some technical problems we weren't able to share them in time, and they reflect back to the early launch of our 111 services, so the calls were undertaken in late March, early April. The first call is regards a mother who's ringing on behalf of a child who's got some symptoms of breathing difficulties, known asthmatic, and wanting to have some advice with regards to how much of their inhaler the child can actually take and whether they could actually overdose or not. The call handler undertakes an assessment which is 7-8 minutes in length, and then feels it's appropriate to hand over to a clinician because the parent recognises that the clinical outcome within Pathways recommends 999. The parent doesn't believe that's an appropriate end point for the child, and so the call handler hands that over to a nurse who then undertakes a further assessment and agrees at the conclusion of the call, which is excessive at 17 minutes plus, to take the child to the accident and emergency department. And the second call that we board members will have reviewed is relating to a young lady who's undergone a LETS procedure, which is a minor gynecological procedure, and she's experienced some abdominal pain and some unforeseen consequences that she's actually receiving treatment for, but she's got further concerns, and she undergoes an assessment with one of our call handlers. Again, it's a little bit longer than we would have anticipated, however reaches what I believe for the time of day and instance is an appropriate outcome, and refers the patient on. Both of the patients, on giving their consent for the board to review their calls, had report to have been very satisfied with their experiences.
Thank you, Tricia. Does anybody want to make any comments or ask any questions about those calls? I'd like to, about the one with the asthmatic child, but I'm happy to go in the queue.
After you.
Yeah, I'll have a go in a minute.
Okay.
I'd like to.
Which one are we doing first?
Okay. We'll talk about the asthma one first. Okay, which is the one that I had most of my issues about. So I thought that the caller was quite generous in rating this call 4 out of 5. The thing that really struck me was that she called in, and I think this is a problem not necessarily only to 111, we've had this with Eric as well. She phoned in with a very specific question. And the question was, can I give my daughter more of her inhaler? I can't remember how much I was told I could give her, and she seems to be a bit shaky. She repeated that 4 times in the course of the answer. So it was as though our staff were on one track, which was determined by the system and pathways. Our job is to assess the symptoms and tell you what to do. She was on a different track. I think that was just really unfortunate. And what we could have done, I think, is made the link and say, well, we understand that this is your question, but we think it would be important to either, whatever, I'm sure our staff would be able to express this much better than I can, but we think it's important to assess your daughter's symptoms so that we can advise you what to do. And that was never explained about why they were doing what they were doing. And it got to the point where there was a real, I think, mismatch, where the nurse actually asked the mother, well, what is the maximum dose? And she said, no, I'm asking you, what is the maximum dose? I don't know what the maximum dose is. So I think that was a problem. The other thing I think was a problem was the nurse was quite difficult to hear and understand. And I think that if you listen carefully, it was pretty clear that the caller wasn't really understanding, wasn't able to catch what the nurse was saying, and that those cues weren't really picked up. So I do have some fairly significant concerns. And I think there was a further debate about whether I don't think that the caller would have recognised the description, which was, I think, made 3 times, that she had refused an ambulance. I don't think that was what it felt like to her. I think what it felt like was that the ambulance had come up and it was agreed between them that that wasn't the right thing to do. But she was told 3 times that she'd refused an ambulance. So my concerns about that are call review, really. I mean, they come back to how are we going to, given all the things that Sue was talking about how difficult it is to improve these calls given the systems that we've got, what can we actually realistically do to give patients a better experience given the tools that we've got, or tools we can use? Other comments and thoughts?
Sort of cover, I mean, you've covered it well, I think.
Tim, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I echo exactly what you've said. This was an abject 111 failure, I thought, if only for the fact that the service didn't provide what the mother wanted, and the outcome was as if she hadn't contacted the service in the first place. So with added cost to the NHS, achieved absolutely nothing except delay. In fact, I disagree clinically with the outcome, because had she been given more of the inhaler, she would have probably been fine and not needed to trouble anyone. And we weren't at any stage able to establish through pathways questioning how much of the inhaler she'd really had. So I think this was a total and utter failure on part of the system, not helped by the way perhaps that we approached it.
I mean, is it possible that this should have been a medicines inquiry? I mean, identified as a medicines inquiry. I don't know, I've got a nod over here and a shake over there.
Well, my view is no, Joanne, because my view was the parent was clearly describing the child was still having breathing difficulties. It'd taken the inhaler a number of times because the parent clearly recognised and had been advised previously when having breathing difficulties that they could give more than the regular dose of their inhaler. But the child was experiencing very clear symptoms. I do hear Tim's view of the failure in the parent wanted to know what level is an overdose of the inhaler. And when I reviewed that call, I believed it was appropriate that the child was actually assessed further face to face, because the parent clearly describes that the child had been given additional doses of the inhaler, but it wasn't resolving the breathing difficulties the child was experiencing. So my belief is that if a caller rings through with a medicines inquiry, we have a view to offer a clinical assessment, which goes back to your first point. The parent was ringing in how much is an overdose and how many times can they use it. We should have been clearly able to articulate we can advise you on that, but seeing as the child's got some clinical symptoms, do you wish to undergo a clinical assessment and continue? So then we could have signposted to just the medicines inquiry if the parent just wanted that, or to a clinical assessment if they'd have accepted and recognised the deterioration.
Let's hold that thought. I just want to go to Louisa.
I mean, I thought it was reminding me of the calls we had with GPs triaging. I think a GP would have managed this in 2 sentences. This should have taken 17 minutes to come to an outcome. So I think I agree. I think this is a real failure. Failure the system doesn't really sort of out anything. And I would agree with you that it's a shame that we would think this was a high quality call having not personally listened to it. I'd be interested to see what Kat thinks actually.
Yeah. Let's just Kat, that gives you a few minutes to
think
put your many thoughts together while I go to Nick.
Actually, both calls, I know we're only discussing this first call, but both calls I had this sense that there was a 111 system being used, but actually the way that staff tried to deal with this was with reference to the system that they've been running previously, and that the outcome and in relation to the child of a 999 ambulance very clearly was felt to be not the right outcome, both by the health advisor and by the mother. But of course, the reason that it's described as a refusal is because the call handler or health advisor is under absolutely strict instructions not to put their own judgment into this. And actually, their job is to auto-dispatch the ambulance unless the caller refuses. And I think what you saw here was the health advisor referring to their previous experience and using, quotes, their judgment and common sense to refer this case to the nurse, which is of course what they would have done in an 0845 scenario. And I agree with you that there were language difficulties in the interaction with the nurse, and I question whether the A&E was the right outcome, and I would have thought the right outcome would have been a further telephone conversation with the GP out of hours organisation, possibly with a doctor. With a GP out of hours, yeah. Okay, sorry, it was in hours. You're quite right. So it could have been with the surgery, and I question whether A&E was actually the right outcome. Interesting, of course, that the nurse spoke to the patient themselves in order to get some, but they got some indication of breathlessness, I dare say, from that conversation, but actually established something.
Yeah, no.
Just as a footnote, I think it's regrettable that we have a system that requires call handlers to ask the mother of a 12-year-old whether they're pregnant, and whether there's some kind of age cut-off at which that simply shouldn't be asked, and whether that's built into a further release of pathways, because of course the system knows how old the patient is.
the pejorative language, because to say you've refused an ambulance is also distressing.
To say what, sorry?
Well, to relay to somebody on call you've refused an ambulance is also distressing.
So I thought crucial to me was the 999 interreaction and the fact that the outcome here was more sensible than that, but actually I'm not sure that that's what the system has determined.
Okay, Kat, did you have any thoughts about it?
Yes, I mean, I'll comment without having been able to actually listen to the recordings. I'm just going on the notes of what's been said just now. But I mean, for me, it kind of suggests it smacks of a case which will never be dealt with by Pathways. To be honest, the system will not be designed to answer these kind of specific medical questions. And for me, it adds something about, well, this is where complementary services which complement Pathways-driven systems could come into their own. The other thing it brings up is that this area of refused dispositions is a huge area. I mean, Pathways will always be risk adverse, but the more we hear, and I'm assuming, and I'll check up when I go to the governance meeting tomorrow, that Pathways are collating evidence behind refused dispositions, I think they will focus on some very common pathways to be able to delve into, to be able to provide a more clinically appropriate outcome. Just in relation to Nick's point about the sort of asking pregnancy, I believe the cut-off for England and Wales is 12, but it's 10 in Scotland. So.
Well, there you go.
Can I just add, Pathway, I did discuss the issue of asking inappropriate questions with the senior Pathways team at a recent review I had with them, and they were very clear with me that our call handlers have to answer the question, not necessarily ask it. So if they believe they've already been given the information, they don't need to repeat the question again, or if they believe the question is inappropriate for the person they're speaking to, they can move on from it. But it's a very fine line when you've got call handlers who are assessing patients, and there is a whole myriad of clinical issues that patients ring in. You can be moving from somebody such as the young lady who's had a gynecological procedure 1 minute into a patient who's ringing with chest pain the next. So it's a very fine line asking our staff to omit questions and to use their critical thinking, and for them to get that very fine balance right. Our mature and our long-serving staff do get there, but we need to remember that these staff were often very new to the service at launch, and this was in the very early days of service delivery.
Okay, I'm going to come back to call review in a second, but then I want to, before that, I'd like to go back to Louisa.
Well, just a slightly, it's actually just slightly off the topic, if that's okay. It just struck me that would we ever be able to get to enough granular detail? We were looking at some AHTs for winter. Are there any algorithms for winter conditions that are going to sort of trigger ambulance dispositions? It just seems that there are some things like the sort of the are you always breathless, are you always, that have a very low threshold for triggering an ambulance, and then add a huge amount of time with average handling time.
So in the last couple of weeks, as Chris referred to earlier in the performance, the clinical team have been doing ACE workshops. So there is a module 2 within Pathways where staff 6 weeks post being signed off as competent for using the system come back offline and review for a day a number of calls and how they are using the system. We believed we could do something differently with our staff, and we've continued the Achieving Clinical Excellence workshops. So each individual person looks at their profile of where they're referring patients to and particular algorithms which they have difficulty with, and it's already demonstrating some improvements with collective groups and individuals as well, and that's certainly something we'll continue over the summer months to focus on the breathing difficulties and things for the winter months to improve not only our performance but for patients to have a better experience and better outcomes, and to be using our NHS systems appropriately.
Can I then, thank you Tricia, come back to this question of review. So, I had a few things that I was concerned about in this call, and there are some more granular ones. For instance, the nurse started talking about cough. She mentioned cough 3 times, but I don't think cough had been mentioned by either the mother or the health advisor. So there are new, and question on, in particular, the intelligibility of the nurse. I mean, her idiomatic English wasn't great. So, you know, and in a situation where you've got a caller with one accent, a speaker with another, idiomatic English not great in a health situation, and it's very difficult. We need to get much better, I think, at providing developmental feedback and being more discriminating in a positive way, and more demanding, again in a positive developmental way, when we listen to calls, to give people the opportunity to do better. I think that nurse could probably, I would say she was 6 out of 10 or something. She could probably be 9 out of 10, but she won't get there if she does call after call like this and nobody says, actually, the thing that you would need to do to give the patient a better experience would be this. So what can we do to make our call review more improvement oriented than it is? Okay, so can we please come back to that, unless you have something you particularly want to say now?
Well, just so, because there are a significant number of staff new to the role of doing call review, Janet Haslam, prior to leaving the organisation on Friday, had undertaken a number of webinars in order to do some levelling across our call review. Initiated anyway by the staff being new to the role, as well as the board's constructive feedback on our call reviews from last month.
And do they listen to calls? When you have a webinar,
Yes.
they have a call they all listen to?
They are all given a call to review. They do their independent review, and then they discuss as a collective group of what did each individual learn and what did they learn as a whole. Because some people score are more critical, and other people are less critical and actually miss bits. So those workshops have been ongoing.
Tim, are you?
Just a quick question, I guess, to Chris perhaps, about the need to repeat the biographics on the handover, warm transfer. We don't presumably repeat them on the auto-dispatch of ambulances, which is rather more dramatic. So why do we do it on the warm transfers?
I don't.
I do.
Sorry, let's ask.
Well, because when you warm transfer, you actually release the call from the call handler. You release the call onto the queue, and so you're given a reference number to pick that call off the queue, which the nurse then does, and then the further demographics is given to make sure if there's 2 Smiths that just happen to be in close proximity on the queue, that the address is correct. But it is something that the clinical and the operational team are looking at, of what is appropriate for governance requirements, to make sure we have the right documentation, because we do think there is some of those elements that are unnecessary. That's why they're doing it at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else on the call reviews? We haven't talked in detail about the other one, but perhaps we don't need to. And I'm sure, Emma, you'll be able to help people with to listen to them. And I would say, please, if everybody could listen to the asthmatic child one that we've talked about. That's the one that really illustrates some of the issues that we've talked about more. Thank you. I haven't been notified of any other business apart from Keisha. Are you going to ask her to? Yeah, that would be great. Any other business apart from that? No? Next meeting of the board is 29th of July here. Anyone online who's prepared to complete a feedback form, we'd be very grateful. I think we're just going to stay in formal board session just for another couple of minutes so that we can thank Keisha. reluctant to be thanked.
Do you think she doesn't want her embarrassment forever recorded on YouTube?
Just say
We could close the recording.
Do it in the
Should we
private
close the
sector.
recording?
Yeah.